Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're heading to India, looking at 25 years of environmental change. And wow, there is a lot to cover.
Yeah, you said it. It's complex for sure.
We're talking air, we're talking water, the noise, even those incredible Himalayan glaciers and the rising seas. It's all connected. And honestly, some of what we found is pretty alarming.
You're not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But get this, understanding what's been happening in India over the last, quarter century, it's actually crucial not just for them, but for the whole planet.
Right. We're talking about a country that's going to be the most populous on Earth soon. Those environmental shifts, they have implications for all of us.
Absolutely.
So to guide us through this, we dug into a fantastic episode of the Impact for Tomorrow podcast. They had this researcher on, really painted a vivid picture of what's going on. And you know me, I love a slightly terrifying statistic. This one blew my mind. Delhi, the number of vehicles on the road, are you ready for this?
Give me.
3 million back in 2000 to almost 13 million today. It's insane.
It really highlights that rapid development, More cars, industry booming, energy use skyrocketing. It all adds up to a pretty major air pollution crisis.
Yeah, and we're not just talking like traffic jams and inconvenience. This is impacting people's health, big time.
A public health emergency. Huge scale.
Okay, so let's break it down. When we say air pollution, what are we actually breathing in here? What's the worst of it?
The podcast episode actually did a great job explaining this. Particulate matter. Those tiny particles,
Yeah.
the ones that lodge deep in your lungs, soot, smoke, dust, all that nasty stuff from car exhaust, factories, even construction. Then there's nitrogen dioxide, another bad one, linked to breathing problems, heart disease, the whole 9 yards.
So we're way past just hazy skies. This is serious stuff. And they mentioned this crazy number in the podcast, 1.2 million premature deaths every year in India because of air pollution.
Think about it like a city the size of San Francisco. Gone each year.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But India's government, they're not just sitting on their hands, are they?
Nope, not at all. They've got this program, the National Clean Air Program, NCFP they call it. Goal is to cut those pollutants 20 to 30% by 2024. Big focus on vehicles, industries, stricter emission standards, the whole bit.
Sounds promising. But honestly, is it working? What the experts on the podcast say.
It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
The researcher they had on, they were optimistic, kinda, acknowledged the progress, but also enforcing these things is tough. And the problem's just so big. Plus, India's economy keeps growing, right?
Right.
More people in the middle class, more cars, more stuff they want to buy. It's a tough balance.
A constant balancing act, trying to grow without, sacrificing the environment in the process. And speaking of balancing acts, let's move to water pollution. The podcast really focused on the Ganges River, a sacred river for millions of Hindus, but also one of the most polluted in the world. That contrast really got to me.
Yeah, it's powerful. The Ganges, a source of life, spiritual for so many, but at the same time, it's facing this huge pollution crisis. Untreated sewage, that's the main villain. Imagine 60% of urban sewage going straight into India's rivers. Untreated.
60%. That's crazy. So what happens when you have that much pollution? What are the consequences downstream?
Think about it. This water, it's used for everything. Drinking, farming, bathing, religious rituals, you name it. The health impacts are devastating.
Yeah.
Waterborne diseases, skin infections, digestive issues, even long-term problems, cancer even. They talked about studies showing higher cancer rates in communities along these rivers.
That's just heartbreaking, especially with, how important the Ganges is culturally and religiously. But I know there have been efforts to clean it up, right? What
Yeah.
about that Namami Gange project? Did the podcast touch on that?
They did. It's a massive initiative by the government to try and revive the Ganges, building new sewage treatment plants, cleaning up the riverbanks, raising awareness, the whole works.
That sounds like a massive undertaking. Is it making a difference?
It's a step in the right direction for sure. But these plants, they're expensive to build and run. And then making sure everyone follows the rules, the industries, the people, it's ongoing.
Sounds familiar. Good intentions, but actually putting it all into practice, that's the tough part. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Noise pollution. We've all been there, right? Honking cars, construction noise, it's maddening. But in cities like Mumbai and Delhi, it's apparently on another level.
Oh, yeah. We tend to think of it as just annoying, but it can really impact your health, your well-being. And in India, Cities like Delhi, Mumbai, they constantly exceed the noise limits the World Health Organization recommends.
It's not just a little loud here and there, it's constant.
Exactly. Wears you down.
So what is it about these cities that makes the noise so bad? Is it just the sheer number of people, the traffic?
Part of it, for sure, densely packed areas, people living and working right on top of each other. But it's also cultural, how noise is viewed.
Interesting.
Honking, it's like a way of communicating on the roads. And then celebrations, festivals, they can get pretty loud too.
So it's a whole mix of things. What about health impacts, though? If you're living in that kind of noise all the time, what does it do to you?
The podcast guest, they talked about all sorts of things. Stress, obviously, anxiety, trouble sleeping, even stuff like high blood pressure, heart problems. Your body's constantly in this fight or flight mode because of the noise.
It makes you realize how much we take silence for granted. Are the authorities doing anything to try and reduce the noise?
They are. They've designated certain areas as silent zones around hospitals, schools, no honking allowed. They're trying noise barriers on highways and encouraging quieter construction methods. But like a lot of things, enforcing those rules is a challenge.
It's that enforcement piece again. Good ideas, but making them stick. Okay, let's go from the busy cities to the Himalayas. Another crisis brewing. Those glaciers melting. And not just a slow melt. We're talking 8 billion tons of ice lost every year.
Mind-boggling, right? Picture these mountains, these incredible natural wonders shrinking before our eyes.
Yeah.
And the consequences are serious. These glaciers feed the rivers, the ones that millions depend on.
Right. So what happens when those rivers start to dry up?
The podcast didn't paint a pretty picture. Water shortages for drinking, for farming, impacting food supplies, people's livelihoods. Hydropower, that's a major energy source in the region. That's at risk too. And then more floods, more landslides as the landscape becomes less stable. It's a whole chain reaction.
Yeah.
Serious domino effect.
And while we hear about melting glaciers a lot in terms of climate change globally, are there things happening locally in the Himalayas that are making things worse?
Absolutely. They talked about black carbon, the soot from diesel engines, wood-burning stoves. It settles on the glaciers, absorbs more sunlight, and that speeds up the melting.
So it's both global and local factors combining. What's being done to try and slow this down?
Well, one thing they're trying is artificial glaciers.
Wait, artificial glaciers? That sounds made up.
They're basically these big structures that capture and freeze meltwater during the winter, then slowly release it in the spring for irrigation, kind of like an ice reservoir.
Wow, that's incredible. Is that enough, though, to really offset the massive amount of ice that's being lost?
It can help locally, for sure. Give communities some water when they need it most. But ultimately, to tackle the root of the problem, climate change, we need a global effort to cut emissions.
Right, it all circles back. Okay, one last topic for this part of our dive, rising sea levels. I know India has a long coastline, major cities right on the water. What happens to those communities as the sea level rises?
It's not a good scenario. Think about Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, huge cities. The podcast talked about the risk of them literally being underwater, at least partially. Millions displaced, infrastructure destroyed, freshwater sources contaminated.
It's hard to even imagine, and it's not just the cities, is it? What about the natural areas, the ecosystems along the coast?
Exactly. They highlighted the Sundarbans, this massive mangrove forest between India and Bangladesh. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, this amazing ecosystem, and it helps protect against storms and erosion. But rising seas, they're threatening to wipe it out. Communities displaced, biodiversity lost.
Like a domino effect again, one impact leading to another. So what's India doing to try and deal with rising sea levels? Are they building seawalls, moving people? What are the options?
It's a multi-pronged approach. Investing in things like seawalls, breakwaters, those hard defenses for vulnerable areas. But also mangrove restoration projects, recognizing how valuable those natural barriers are. And in some places, they're even looking at planned relocation, moving communities away from the highest risk zones.
It's a complex situation, that's for sure. No easy answers. Before we dive into solutions in part 2, I just want to acknowledge, all of this is heavy stuff. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of these problems.
It is daunting, for sure. But it's important to remember, amidst all this, there's also incredible resilience, creativity, a deep connection to the environment in India. And in part 2, we're going to look at some of the inspiring solutions that are emerging. Because even in the face of all this, there is hope.
Okay, gotta admit, part 1 of this deep dive got kind of heavy. But hey, brighter side, right? What about those glimmers of hope, those solutions coming out of India's environmental journey? I think we could all use a little optimism boost.
I hear yes. And the good news is there's a lot happening. India, they're used to challenges, but they've also got this amazing ability to innovate, find solutions, especially at the community level.
Okay, now that's what I want to hear. Give me some specifics. Where are we seeing these solutions in action?
Well, remember those 13 million vehicles we talked about in Delhi?
Oh, yeah, hard to forget that image.
One of those promising things is the push for electric vehicles.
Mm.
India set a pretty ambitious goal, 30% of all vehicle sales electric by 2030.
Mm.
And it's gaining momentum, for sure.
That's a big jump. But are people actually buying electric cars in India? Are they, like, affordable? Is the infrastructure there to support them?
Great questions. It's a big shift, happening on multiple levels. The cost of electric vehicles is going down globally. India is no exception. Plus, the government's offering incentives, tax breaks, subsidies to make them more attractive to buyers.
Smart move. So what about charging stations? Are those popping up everywhere?
Definitely. You're seeing them everywhere. Public places, apartment buildings, offices becoming more and more common. Some companies are even trying out battery swapping technology. You just swap out your depleted battery for a full one, super quick, like a gas station, but for electric cars.
That is so cool. Love that. Switching gears a bit, renewable energy. I know India's been making huge strides in solar power.
Absolutely. They've got tons of sunshine, and they're using it. Big investments in those massive solar farms, and the cost of solar energy has plummeted, making it super competitive with fossil fuels.
Wow.
In some areas, solar is actually the cheapest electricity source now.
That's amazing. Always seems like we hear about cost being a barrier to renewable energy, so that's encouraging. What about wind power, though?
Wind is booming too, especially in states like Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. They've got those long coastlines, perfect for wind farms. And they're even starting to try out offshore wind farms, where the wind's even stronger and more consistent.
Offshore wind farms. Hold on, explain that one.
Basically, wind farms built out in the ocean. Further from shore, stronger winds, and you don't have the visual impact on the landscape. More clean energy without taking up land space.
So cool. So electric vehicles, huge investments in renewables. It sounds like India is really serious about ditching fossil fuels.
Definitely. And it's not just about cutting emissions, it's about jobs, the economy too. The renewable energy sector is creating tons of jobs, especially in rural areas. A win-win.
Love that. What about water pollution, though? Remember that crazy stat, 60% of sewage going straight into the rivers untreated? Any innovative solutions for that massive problem?
There are. Some of them pretty low tech, actually, using nature itself. One thing gaining traction is constructed wetlands.
Constructed wetlands. What in the world are those?
Basically, they're man-made ecosystems that mimic natural wetlands. Plants and microorganisms working together to filter and clean the wastewater. Natural, sustainable way to treat sewage, and it's often way cheaper than those traditional treatment plants.
Wait, so plants can actually clean up our mess?
They can, and not just sewage. These wetlands can be used for industrial wastewater, agricultural runoff, all sorts of stuff. They're like little eco-warriors.
That's amazing. Love how nature often holds the solutions we need. Much better than dumping chemicals everywhere.
Okay, we've talked about some awesome solutions for air, for water, but what about those melting glaciers? Any bright spots on that front?
There are some really fascinating work being done with, get this, artificial glaciers.
Artificial glaciers? Sounds kind of sci-fi, like fake icebergs or something. Not quite icebergs. They're more like these cone-shaped structures called ice stupas built in the winter. They capture and freeze the meltwater, and then in the spring, when it warms up, the ice melts slowly, providing water for irrigation.
Like a giant ice battery. Genius. Who thought of that?
It was this engineer in Ladakh, a region in the Himalayas, hit hard by water shortages. He was inspired by traditional ice storage techniques and adapted them for a larger scale.
Love it. Another example of how traditional knowledge can lead to modern solutions. But are these artificial glaciers, are they enough to offset the massive amount of ice that's being lost?
They can help locally, definitely, give communities water when they need it. But to really address the root cause, the melting, we need to tackle climate change globally, cut emissions.
Right, the global picture again. Okay, last one, rising sea levels. We talked about how vulnerable India is. What are some of the solutions being used to protect communities, protect those coastal ecosystems?
Mangrove restoration is a big one. Remember how we talked about those mangrove forests, natural barriers against storms and erosion?
Yeah, the Sundarbans, those guardians of the coast.
Exactly. A lot of these forests have been destroyed, development, pollution, shrimp farming. But now there's this big movement to restore them.
So they're actually planting new mangroves. That's a big job.
It is. But it's an investment.
Hmm.
Mangroves don't just protect against erosion and storms, they also absorb CO2, like carbon sinks.
And they create habitat for all kinds of wildlife. I'm definitely feeling more hopeful now. India is really pushing the envelope with these sustainable solutions. And a lot of them are community driven, right?
Absolutely. Local people are taking action, working with scientists, engineers, coming up with innovative ways to protect their environment, their way of life.
That's what gives me the most hope. People coming together, working toward a common goal.
Okay, we've explored solutions, but now I'm curious about the bigger picture. What does all of this mean globally? What can the rest of the world learn from what's happening in India?
Okay, so we've really journeyed through India's environmental landscape, haven't we? The pollution, the glaciers, the rising seas, but also those amazing solutions people are coming up with. What I keep thinking about is the ripple effect. Like, does what's happening in India actually impact the rest of the world?
Oh, it does,
Mm.
on multiple levels, really. Think about it. India's on track to have the biggest population on Earth, even more than China. The sheer scale of their environmental stuff, the good and the bad, it's going to have global consequences, no doubt.
So if they can really shift towards a more, sustainable model, that's huge for other developing nations. It's like, hey, if India can do it, maybe we can too.
Exactly. It kind of breaks that idea that economic growth always has to come at the cost of the environment. India is showing that you can pursue both, even with a massive population.
And their leadership in things like renewable energy, solar especially, that's going to be influencing global markets, right?
For sure. When India invests in solar and wind, that demand actually drives down the cost for everyone globally. It makes those technologies more accessible. They're proving renewables can work on a massive scale.
It's like a testing ground, but with real world stakes. What about beyond energy? Anything else the world can learn from India's environmental challenges and how they're tackling them?
Absolutely. Take their water pollution issues, the Ganges especially. It's a serious warning for any country developing quickly. Shows how important it is to plan cities well, build the infrastructure for wastewater treatment. Those things can get left behind if economic growth takes off too fast.
Right, a cautionary tale about balancing progress with protecting the environment. And those melting glaciers, that's climate change, plain and simple, affecting water resources way beyond India.
Exactly. It shows how urgent it is to cut those greenhouse gas emissions. Benefits everyone, not just the Himalayan region. Plus, some of the innovations India is trying, those artificial glaciers, for example, they could be adapted for other places facing water shortages because of climate change.
It's all connected, isn't it? What happens in India, it affects us all, and their solutions might hold answers for other parts of the world too.
That's the key takeaway here, I think. What we see in India, it's like a mini version of the global environmental challenges we all face. And their journey, it's full of lessons, valuable ones, for everyone.
A reminder that we're all part of this, this big web of life sharing the planet. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what can we do as individuals to help create a more sustainable future for India, for everyone?
Well, staying informed is huge. Knowing what's going on, supporting the organizations working on these issues, pushing for better policies, and then every choice we make, it matters. Cutting back on what we consume, supporting businesses that are eco-conscious, it all adds up.
It's about understanding that even small actions, when lots of people do them, they can make a big difference. Our choices, right now, they're shaping the future of this planet for all of us.
Beautifully said. As we finish up here, I want to leave our listeners with a thought. We've looked at India's story, but what about your own community? What are the challenges, the solutions that are unique to where you live?
Hmm.
Because creating a sustainable future, it's a team effort, it's a tapestry, woven one thread at a time.
Love that image. So as we sign off, keep exploring, keep learning, keep engaging. This deep dive, it's just the start of a much bigger conversation. Thanks for joining us.